We've been learning about what it would be like to travel west in a covered wagon, and we made our wagons last week and took notes about the food and tools that they would take with them, and then we packed our wagons with those tools and foods. And today what we're going to do is we are going to read a little bit more about what it would be like to travel in a covered wagon. And as I'm reading, I want you to make a list, a brainstorm list of things on here of reasons why you would or would not want to travel in a covered wagon. So find this paper. It is behind your Oreo here. So we're going to use this later on this week, but I want you to find the milk one with lines, and you're going to make a list of things that help support your opinion as to why or why not you would want to travel in a covered wagon. Okay, so we learned about what they would take with them, and we know that it was a long journey. We know that they had to take a lot of things with them. One thing that they encountered were rivers. There weren't any roads. There were kind of some wagon tracks that you could follow, but no paved roads like we have today. And so sometimes they had to cross rivers, and there was a few different ways to do that. One was to wait until it was cold and frozen, and you could travel over the river while it was frozen. You could also wait until the rivers went down a little bit when there hadn't been a lot of rain, and you could just kind of pull your wagon across. But it says it could take over an hour to get across the river if you were trying to kind of float it along. And if there were a lot of wagons, it could take up to 5 days to get everybody across. And sometimes the wagons tipped over while crossing the rivers and everything was lost in the river. And if the river flowed quickly, the wagon could be dragged away and you couldn't catch it. And then you wouldn't have all of your belongings or your wagon anymore, which would have been quite dangerous. It says, how far would you travel in a day? We learned about this in our transportation comparison, but it says usually today on the highway you can travel 65 or 70 miles in 1 hour, and in a covered wagon it might take you 6 or 7 days to go as far as we can go in an hour. You would usually have to get up really early, so that might be something that you want to write on your milk carton, is if you don't like getting up early. They had to get up early, some around 4 o'clock when it was still dark. They would start a fire and cook breakfast, and then they would load up the wagons and get going by about 7 o'clock. They would usually travel until lunchtime, rest, and then they would travel again for about till about 4 or 5 or sometimes 6, and then you would stop until the next day. So you would have had to travel 2,000 miles in about 6 months. That would only take about 3 to 4 days in a car now, or 3 to 4 hours in an airplane. We talked a little bit about this when we learned about wagons, but you would not ride in the wagon. The wagon was extremely bumpy, and so you would bump up and down and get kind of motion sick. It wasn't very comfortable. They didn't have cozy seats like we have. They just had wooden boards to sit on, and there was a ton of stuff in the covered wagon, all the food and tools that we talked about last week. So even the drivers sometimes would walk alongside the oxen just because they needed a break from sitting on the bumpy wagon as well. But that's what you did. You walked on the side of the wagon alongside the wagon with it instead of riding. You might jump up and ride for a little bit, but they didn't stay in it very long. You could feel every little bump. What were the dangers and difficulties of the trip? So one of the biggest problems was mud. Sometimes it would rain for days on the prairies, and then there would be mud, and more mud. You could sink right up to your knees in mud, and if you could sink, so could the oxen, cows, and horses. When the sun came out, most of the mud would dry up in a few hours. Sometimes, though, the wagon wheels would still be stuck. Then the children would help gather long grasses. You would lay them across the ground in front of the wagon wheels. Then the oxen would pull from the front, and people would push from behind. The wheels would turn onto the grass and slowly come up out of the mud. The opposite problem is when the ground was too dry. Then there would be dust, so much dust that it would get in your eyes, your mother's eyes, your father's eyes, your cattle's eyes. The dust would be so thick you could hardly see your hand in front of your face. So hold up your hand in front of your face and imagine the dust being so thick that you can't even see your hand. When that happened, sometimes you had to stop traveling because you couldn't see the trail at all. Most of the time, though, you just kept going anyway and hoped you were going in the right direction. Another problem that a lot of them faced on the trail was sickness. Some people became very ill with high fevers and aches and pains. Both grown-ups and children got diseases called cholera and malaria, and sometimes they died on the trip. You would pass many grave markers by the side of the trail as your wagon went by. Today, there's medicine to keep you from getting these diseases and to cure you if you do get them. But people didn't know as much about diseases and medicine in the 1840s as they know today. So this is one thing that might be in the pro column for why you would want to travel west in a covered wagon, and that's because you would usually sleep out under the stars, which some of you may enjoy that or like camping. There wasn't enough room in the wagon for everyone to have a mattress, so usually your mom and dad had a mattress. They might have babies or little children in the wagon sleeping. If it was raining, you would either go in the wagon or under the wagon to stay dry, and sometimes they had little tents that they could dig up, but you could sleep under the stars, which was pretty cool. And if you laid back, you could think about how much longer it would take you to get to Oregon. So here's some examples of the kinds of clothes that they wore. They didn't take a lot of clothes with them because, again, the wagons were full of tools and food. I think in our field trip, she said that they took 2 outfits, one to wear, and then the other one was kind of a backup when that one got dirty, and then you'd wash them down in the river. It was important to have hats and bonnets because they were out in the sun all day long, and the clothes had to be made of strong materials because they had to last a really long time. They would often bring needles and thread to fix the clothes and shoes along the way, but they dressed in these kind of outfits that you see here in these pictures. So here's another thing that it neither may make you say, yes, I would want to travel, or no, I would not want to travel in a covered wagon. It says, what would you eat? For the first part of the trip, you would eat mostly what you brought in the wagon: biscuits, potatoes, bacon, dried meat, crackers, dried fruit, cornmeal, beans, and eggs. Then, just when there was no hard biscuits left, you would start eating fried bread. There were no real ovens to bake bread in, so your mother would mix dough and fry it in a pan. At first, it was nice to have something new, but then it got very boring to eat the same thing over and over again. You would be glad to travel into new territory where there were wild onions and berries of all kinds, and where you might catch catfish in the rivers and trout in the mountain streams. If you were carrying eggs in a bumpy wagon, traveling across rivers and up and down hills and over mountains, how would you keep them from breaking? Some of the pioneers put the eggs in the flour barrel, making sure the eggs didn't touch each other. The only problem with this was your hands would get all white whenever you reached in to dig out an egg. Everybody wanted butter because it made the dried biscuits and fried bread taste better. The pioneers would get milk for making butter from the cows they brought. But after traveling all day, making dinner, rounding up the cattle, fixing broken things, and doing all the other chores, there wasn't much time left to make butter. But the women discovered an easy way to make it. They would hang a milk can from the wagon hoops or tie it to the side of the wagon. As the wagon bumped along the trail, the milk bounced around so much that in a few hours, when you opened the can, there was a ball of butter at least an inch thick and lots of smaller pieces. The butter had made itself. After traveling for many weeks, the wagon trains moved into buffalo country, and that meant new meat or new and delicious food, the buffalo meat. So the buffalo meat, they made it last a long time by making it, they dried it out kind of like beef jerky, so it'd be like buffalo jerky. So they would dry it out so that it wouldn't go bad, and they would tie it to the strings of their wagon to help them get dried out. Okay, this is always one that's kind of a make or break for students. So if they needed to build a fire to make their food, right, because they didn't have an oven along the way, and so they would have to build a fire, but you can see there's not a lot of trees. And since there's not a lot of trees, there's not a lot of wood to make a fire. And so they had to find something else to burn to make their fire so they could cook their food. So it says, out on the plains, you would sometimes travel for days without seeing any trees or wood that you could use to build a fire. So the pioneers had to find something else that would burn easily. They discovered that dried buffalo droppings, called buffalo chips, made a hot, clean fire with little smoke and no smell. So if you haven't caught on yet, that's buffalo poop. Usually children would take baskets and collect the buffalo chips before dinner. So this would have been your job if you were out on the trail. It could take 3 full baskets to cook a meal. It often got very windy on the plains, so the safest way to make a fire was to dig a trench 10 inches deep, 6 inches wide, and about 2 feet long. Then you would put the chips down in the trench and light them with matches or by setting off gunpowder. When the wagon trains reached the Rocky Mountains, there were no more buffalo chips, and it was still sometimes hard to find wood, so the pioneers burned dead sagebrush branches and even the sage roots. Children would gather the dead sage the night before, so you could have a fire for cooking breakfast. Okay, they did sometimes run into Native Americans because, remember, Native Americans were there first, and the pioneers were taking over their land. And so they would sometimes meet the Native Americans, and there would be some tension because the Native Americans didn't like these settlers coming and taking over their land. But a lot of times, if it was a friendly tribe, then they might want to trade things. So you would give them things that they wanted, and they would give you things that you needed. Like maybe the pioneers wanted moccasins. The Native Americans made the moccasins out of buffalo skin, and they were super strong. And then the Indians also wanted cloth, red paint, glass beads, and metal fishing hook. So they would sometimes trade with each other. If they were not friendly, then there was sometimes that they would try to steal the horses and cattle, so they would have to make a wagon train circle and keep their animals inside to hopefully keep them safe. But they sometimes did fight. There was sometimes fighting that would happen when they came across each other. Now, here's a cool thing about traveling in a covered wagon. So you wouldn't actually go to school. Nature was kind of your school. So often there was an older person who would do some reading and writing and math lessons with the kids, and the children would study their readers. But many families didn't have the room to bring books, and so they would just have to learn from the things out in nature. Some people said that the whole trip was one great big school because you were learning new things every day. You might learn the names of flowers or animals you had never seen before. You would learn about fixing things when they broke down because you couldn't just go to a store. You would learn about cooking outdoors and tying up animals so they had enough room to eat but couldn't run away. And you would learn about animals that you saw along the way too. So that might be something, it's kind of an adventure that you would have enjoyed. So what chores would you do as a kid? So we already learned about the buffalo chips, but you would also milk cows, fetch water from rivers, help cook the food, wash dishes. You would help skin and prepare buffalo or deer or turkey meat. Sometimes you would sit by the campfire and listen to stories, and you would also shake out blankets and hang the jerky to dry. So could you have fun on the trip? Yes, you would have fun. There would be a chance to explore as you guys were traveling. They didn't travel very quickly. After dinner, there was usually someone who knew how to play a harmonica or a fiddle, so they would gather around the campfire and sing and dance, and that was fun, tell stories. And you could help with the sewing. You would have big feasts if you found a herd of animals, and you would see a ton of wild animals. You would see prairie dogs, definitely the buffalo, hundreds of buffalo at sometimes. You could see rattlesnakes and owls. You could see wolves or coyotes, jackrabbits, wild turkeys, sage hens, and lizards. You would see antelope, mosquitoes. It says some people think of mosquitoes as wild animals because they saw a lot of them. Then it talks about letters, which we learned a little bit about the Pony Express in one of our reading groups. And then it talks about running out of supplies. So one of the problems was that they would have to get to a trading post or some kind of general store, but those were few and far between. So you might run out of something and not be able to get it for a long time. It was also hard to travel over the mountains, sometimes very dangerous. So they'd have to all work together to get the wagon up. And oftentimes you had to take a trail guide with you because there weren't road signs to show you where to go. But they also had lots of big landmarks that would help, like this one. This is called the Devil's Backbone. And they knew they were on the right track if they got to different points like this. Okay, so I think that is about it. It does talk about how we know what it was like to travel west in a covered wagon. And these are primary sources that they used. A lot of diaries and journals are a primary source because the people who were there experiencing wrote them. So we know a lot about it just from those journals and diaries. And today it says you can still see some of the tracks of the old Oregon Trail, and it did go through Kansas, so there's a chance that you could see it really close to home too. So thinking back over what I just read, I want you to think about your opinion. Okay, so you need to make a choice. Would you want to travel west in a covered wagon? Do you think that sounds fun and exciting? Would you have liked learning about new animals and doing some of the chores and activities and exploring? Or do you think that it would have been horrible to travel west in a covered wagon because you don't want to pick up buffalo chips and it was dangerous and you could get sick and all of those things? So I want you to come up with your opinion first, and then this is just your brainstorming page, so you don't have to write full sentences. I just want you to write out some things, some reasons why you would or reasons why you would not want to travel west in a covered wagon. So just brainstorm your ideas, and then tomorrow we're going to take those ideas and we're going to write them into an opinion piece about whether or not you would want to travel west in a covered wagon.